The sky was already burning. At 20,000 feet above the Pacific, the air trembled with engine roar and distant explosions. Black flak bursts clawed at the clouds. A lone American fighter cut through the chaos, its propeller screaming, wings shuddering under strain. Then, a voice cracked through the radio. Bandit at 6 o'clock, closing fast. Out of the haze, like a ghost refusing to die, a Japanese fighter surged forward, sleek, fast, and deadly. Its engine howled as it dove, sunlight glinting off its wings. This wasn't supposed to happen anymore. The war was ending. Japan was collapsing. And yet here it was. One last fight. The American pilot tightened his grip. Sweat ran into his eyes. He banked hard, G-forces crushing his chest, as tracer fire sliced past his cockpit. The Japanese pilot stayed on him, relentless. No hesitation. No fear. Just pure, final defiance. This wasn't just another dogfight. This was the end of an era, the last clash between two air forces that had defined the Pacific War. And in the next few minutes, everything, honor, survival, and history, would be decided in the sky. The clouds were no longer white. They were stained, blackened by flak, torn apart by shock waves, and lit from within by distant explosions. High above the Pacific, where the air thinned and the world below vanished into haze, two fighters carved through the sky like predators that refused to go extinct. The American aircraft surged forward, engine roaring with controlled fury. Every vibration traveled through the pilot's body, through the stick, through the seat, through his bones. He could feel the machine as if it were alive. Every adjustment mattered. Every second counted. Then came the sound. Not the engine. Not the wind. Gunfire. Short. Controlled. Deadly. He snapped his head to the side. A flash of movement, fast, deliberate. The shape was unmistakable. Long wings. Clean lines. A design born for agility, not survival. A Japanese fighter. Still here. Still fighting. The radio crackled again, but this time it was drowned by something else. The rising, unmistakable scream of an incoming dive. The enemy pilot had altitude. He had speed. And he had intent. The American pilot reacted instantly. Throttle forward. Stick down. The aircraft dropped, hard, into a steep dive, the horizon spinning as he tried to break the enemy's angle. The G-forces crushed against his chest, pulling at his vision, turning the edges of the world gray. Behind him, the Japanese fighter followed. Closer now. Closer than it should have been. Tracer rounds ripped through the air, bright streaks cutting across the sky like burning threads. One passed just beneath his wing. Another tore past the canopy. Too close. Far too close. He rolled sharply to the left, then snapped back right, an aggressive maneuver meant to throw off the attacker's aim. For a moment, just a fraction of a second, the pressure lifted. Then silence. No gunfire. No impact. Just the roar of engines and the endless sky. He glanced back. The Japanese fighter was still there. Unshaken. Unrelenting. And in that moment, something became clear. This wasn't a pilot trying to survive. This was a pilot determined to finish something. To see it through to the very end. The American tightened his grip again, jaw clenched, eyes locked forward. Because now he understood. This wasn't just another engagement. This was something final. Something inevitable. A clash not just of machines, but of everything those machines represented. And as the two aircraft climbed, twisted, and circled each other in the dying light of war, the sky itself seemed to hold its breath. By the summer of 1945, the Pacific War had reached its breaking point. Japan's once dominant air power was shattered. Aircraft factories lay in ruins under relentless bombing. Fuel shortages crippled pilot training. Many of the experienced aviators who once ruled the skies during the early years, over places like the Philippines and Pearl Harbor, were gone. But the aircraft that remained still carried a deadly legacy. American forces, now advancing relentlessly toward the Japanese home islands, relied heavily on fighters like the P-51 Mustang and the F-6F Hellcat. These machines represented the peak of Allied air superiority, fast, heavily armed, and built for endurance. The P-51 Mustang in particular changed everything. With a top speed exceeding 430 miles per hour, long-range fuel capacity, and 6.50 caliber machine guns, it could escort bombers deep into enemy territory and still engage in fierce dogfights. Its Rolls-Royce Merlin engine gave it unmatched high-altitude performance. It wasn't just a fighter, it was a hunter. On the other side, Japan still deployed aircraft like the legendary Mitsubishi A6M Zero. Once feared across the Pacific, the Zero was incredibly agile. It could outturn nearly any opponent. Its lightweight design allowed for breathtaking maneuverability, but at a cost. Minimal armor. No self-sealing fuel tanks. One well-placed burst could turn it into a fireball. By 1945, this difference in philosophy was brutally clear. American aircraft were built to survive. Japanese aircraft were built to win, or die trying. And that difference would define the final dogfights of the war. One such encounter unfolded during the final bombing campaigns over Japan. American bombers, massive B-29 superfortresses, were flying missions over the Japanese mainland. Their objective: destroy the last remnants of Japan's industrial capacity. Escorting them were squadrons of P-51 Mustangs, scanning the skies for any sign of resistance. At first, nothing. Then suddenly, contacts. Japanese fighters climbed desperately to intercept. Among them were some of the last operational Zeros and newer aircraft like the Ki-84H-8, faster and more heavily armed than earlier designs. The sky erupted into chaos. American pilots broke formation to engage. The Mustangs dove, engines screaming, using speed and altitude as their advantage. Japanese pilots responded with tight turns and sudden climbs, trying to lure their enemies into close-range dogfights where agility still mattered. One American pilot spotted a Zero diving toward the bombers. He rolled inverted, pushed the stick forward, and plunged after it. Wind howled across the canopy. The distance closed fast. The Zero pilot saw him. Too late. The Mustang opened fire, 6 streams of tracer rounds ripping through the air. The Zero jerked violently, smoke pouring from its engine. But instead of breaking away, it turned hard, aggressive, coming straight back. This wasn't about survival anymore. This was about duty. The two fighters spiraled downward, twisting through the sky in a deadly dance. Turn. Dot. Climb. Fire. Mississippi repeat. Each second stretched into eternity. But physics and technology couldn't be ignored. The Mustang pulled away in a climb, using its superior engine power. The Zero tried to follow, but its engine strained. In that moment of vulnerability, the American pilot reversed, dove back in, and fired again. This time it was decisive. The Zero burst into flames, trailing smoke as it fell toward the ocean below. Silence followed. Another Japanese aircraft gone. Another piece of history fading. From the Japanese perspective, these final engagements were something deeper than combat. They were acts of resistance. Pilots knew the odds. They knew their aircraft were outmatched. Many lacked proper training due to fuel shortages and accelerated wartime programs. Yet they still climbed into the sky. What? Because for them, surrender wasn't an option. American pilots often reported something chilling during these final dogfights: the refusal of Japanese fighters to disengage. Even when damaged, even when outgunned, they stayed in the fight longer than logic allowed. It wasn't just tactics. It was ideology. This made them unpredictable and dangerous until the very end. Strategically, these last dogfights marked the complete collapse of Japanese air defense. American air superiority was absolute. Bombers could strike cities with minimal opposition. Industrial production crumbled. Supply lines vanished. The skies, once fiercely contested, belonged entirely to the Allies. But these final aerial clashes carried symbolic weight. They were the last echoes of a war fought not just with machines, but with human will. Each dogfight told the same story. 2 pilots. 2 nations. 1 sky. And only one would return. As these final encounters unfolded, another factor began to shape the outcome: experience versus desperation. American pilots flying escort missions over Japan in 1945 were often veterans. Many had survived multiple campaigns across Europe or the Pacific. They understood energy fighting, how to control speed, altitude, and positioning to dominate an engagement without unnecessary risk. They didn't need to outturn their enemy. They needed to outthink them. Japanese pilots, by contrast, were increasingly inexperienced. Training programs had been shortened drastically. Fuel shortages meant fewer flight hours. Many entered combat with only the basics: takeoff, formation, and attack runs. But what they lacked in experience they often replaced with intensity. They flew closer, engaged longer, took risks seasoned pilots would avoid, and sometimes that made them even more dangerous. In one recorded encounter, an American formation reported a lone Japanese fighter making repeated attack runs, not breaking away even after sustaining visible damage. Each pass grew more erratic, more aggressive, until finally the aircraft dove straight through defensive fire in a last attempt to strike. It missed. But the intent was unmistakable. These weren't conventional tactics anymore. They were the final expressions of a collapsing air force refusing to disappear quietly. In the end, the last dogfight between Japan and America wasn't just a battle, it was a farewell. A final chapter written in smoke and fire, high above a dying empire. The aircraft that once defined the Pacific War, the agile Zero, the unstoppable Mustang, had become symbols of two very different philosophies. One built on precision, power, and survival. The other on courage, sacrifice, and unwavering resolve. And when they met for the last time, the outcome was inevitable, but never easy, because behind every machine was a pilot, a human being, a heartbeat racing against time. By August 1945, the war would come to an end. The skies would fall silent. No more intercepts. No more frantic radio calls. No more desperate climbs into the unknown. But those final dogfights, they linger. In history. In memory. In the haunting image of two fighters locked in combat, knowing, perhaps, that they were witnessing the end of everything they had ever known. The last dogfight wasn't the biggest. It wasn't the deadliest. But it was the most final. Because in those last moments, as engines roared and guns fired one final time, the war in the sky didn't just end. It faded, quietly, violently, into history. Long after the engines fell silent, the meaning of those last dogfights remained. Not in official reports. Not in victory tallies. But in what they represented. Because by the final months of the war, the outcome was no longer uncertain. The industrial might of the United States had overwhelmed Japan's ability to respond. The skies over the Pacific had shifted, from contested battlegrounds to controlled corridors of destruction. And yet, those final fights still happened. Again and again. Not because they would change the war, but because, for the men in those cockpits, the war wasn't over until they stopped flying. The American pilots returned to their carriers and airfields, their aircraft scarred but intact. They logged their missions, counted their victories, prepared for the next sortie. But even they understood something unusual about those final encounters. The resistance hadn't faded. It had intensified. Japanese pilots, facing impossible odds, had chosen to meet them head-on, again and again, long after logic suggested retreat. It left an impression. A quiet one. The kind that stays with you. Because war at its core is not just about who wins. It's about who keeps going, even when the end is already written. When the war finally ended, the aircraft that once ruled the skies were grounded for the last time. The roar of engines gave way to silence. Airfields that had once launched hundreds of fighters a day became still. But history doesn't forget motion. It remembers moments. And among those moments are the final dogfights, brief, violent, and deeply human. Two aircraft. Two pilots. Both knowing, in some way, that they were part of something ending. Not just a mission. Not just a battle. But an entire era of aerial warfare defined by propellers, instinct, and raw skill. And perhaps that's why the last dogfight matters. Not because of who fired the final shot, but because of what it meant to be there, at the very edge of history, when the sky, for the first time in years, finally began to fall silent.